Continue to reflect on that meeting. Associate Professor and Deputy Director of the SACHI Chair on African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Lisa Otto, joins us now. Lisa, good morning. Thanks for waking up early with us. I know last night all eyes were, of course, glued to the screens watching that encounter and the press briefing that was given after by our president. But President Ramaphosa remained calm and diplomatic during what many described as a public ambush. Two questions. Did he go far enough in directly challenging Trump's misinformation on the alleged white genocide? Was staying composed the best strategy, or did it risk legitimizing falsehoods by not firmly denouncing them on the spot?
I think that he did the best that he could by also deferring to those voices that Trump might have been more receptive to, coming in the form of Johann Rupert and indeed Retief Gross and Ernie Els, even John Steenhuisen. I think it was important to keep that cordiality because one doesn't want things to kind of descend even further. And at the end of the day, the ultimate goal was to try to kind of restart these bilateral relations. And so that sense of cordiality, I think, was there. And I do think that it was underscored repeatedly by everybody in the South African entourage that there is no white genocide.
When we saw the inclusion of Johann Rupert, Ernie Els and Retief Gross, it was, of course, a strategic move to appeal to Trump's sensibilities, as you just said. But do such optics dilute the seriousness of the political message, especially when confronting loaded and racially charged narratives like land reform and farm attacks?
I don't think so. I think that it was important for Ramaphosa to bring these kinds of people with him because it's these channels that have, I think, enabled this meeting to take place in the first place. And these, I think, are the voices that Trump is likely going to kind of resonate with a little bit more. At the end of the day, the way that Trump approaches government is not the kind of standard way. He's not always respectful of kind of process and protocol and those kinds of things. He has his own way of doing things. And I think South Africa has recognized that and needs to play towards that and has done that with this particular meeting.
So given this global broadcast, Lisa, of the Oval Office exchange, how do you assess the long-term impact or influence of Ramaphosa's performance on South Africa's international image, particularly in the context of investor confidence and racial reconciliation narratives?
I think in terms of the global image, I think that the majority of our partners around the world understand that we do not have a white genocide. They understand that we have many challenges, corruption, crime, infrastructure deficits, and so on. So I think that's quite clear. I think it was good that the South African delegation had come with a degree of honesty, really, to this meeting. I think it was a very kind of candid conversation. Now, whether you see a change also in terms of the bilateral relationship, I think the jury is still out on that. I think we'll have to wait and see what comes out of the rest of this visit.
I'm going to circle back to that one, but I want to go back to this. Trump appeared to conflate opposition rhetoric such as Julius Malema's remarks with official government policy. Do you think the president did enough to separate government policy from populism in the eyes of an international audience?
Again, I think he tried, but probably things could have been taken a little bit further. I think Steenhuisen did try to kind of underscore, that this coalition government has been set up, on one hand, actually to sideline those kind of more radical and extreme components of the kind of South African political makeup. I do think that, these kinds of messages, the kind of top line, will need to be reiterated continually via the channels where this is possible in order to just really underscore and give a more accurate representation about what the political environment is like in South Africa, what our laws say about these various things, and what South Africa's foreign policy goals and objectives are.
So we saw the president try to go back to placing emphasis on trade, on cooperation, on regional peace building. Trump did seem to fixate on land and race. How effective was Ramaphosa in shifting the conversation back to substantive policy issues, not just him and his team? Did the president walk away with concrete wins for South Africa?
I think, part of that, the answers will come from the closed-door meetings, which, you and I are obviously not privy to. But I do think there was a sense from the delegation of trying to play to the kind of psychology of Trump. So there was this kind of thanking him for some of his policy positions and efforts. There were several, I think, calls to say, we need American help, we need investment, and we believe that America can play that role. So, trade and investment, I think, is important. And I think there's an effort there to try and steer away from these kind of racialized politics towards more substantive, concrete issues where there can be a deal. We know that Trump loves making deals. And we also know that South Africa is in need of growing its economy in order to address these challenges, of which I think to use kind of quotation marks, the refugee situation has emerged out of. And so I think it is important to kind of focus on those things. And it does seem there that the kind of strategy has been kind of a gentle approach, but also one that comes with a degree of honesty. My personal sense was, I think the delegation needn't have been quite so graphic about the descriptions of crime in South Africa. But I think that's the bottom line there. There was honesty and openness. And I think the approach was to go gently so as not to inflame things further.
Lisa, just in closing, and maybe on a different note, it's not a popularity contest, we know that, but there's so much commentary around who acquitted themselves well in the room. What were the missed opportunities? Who deviated the message? And I'd love your thoughts on what some of the standout voices were in that room last night.
Well, I think, it's useful to have the assessment of somebody like Johann Rupert, whom I think is the kind of person Trump has a great deal of respect for. And I think he gave a very balanced kind of view of, especially, the crime situation and, the realities on the ground. I don't think that Retief Goosen got the brief entirely with some of the comments that he made around crime. And I do also think that a trade union official who was there could have been a little bit less graphic in her descriptions. But I think broadly speaking, given the context, the historical context around the bilateral relationship, things probably went as well as we could have expected them to. They didn't quite descend into that as bad as things were with the Zelensky meeting that we also saw televised. I think while it was a little bit mixed, for the most part, there was a degree of cordiality. And I think this is a good starting point to kind of move things forward.
And a great ending point for our conversation. Thank you very much for talking to us this morning. Associate Professor and Deputy Director of the SACHI Chair on African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Lisa Otto.